Hi everyone. In this video I'm going to show you how you can take data about your personal finances as collected in mint.com, extract it, and build reporting around that using Power BI. In doing so, I'll demonstrate how to create useful measures and put them in visualizations that help tell a story about your financial progression over time. First of all, what's mint.com? It's a site that's been around for quite some time, most recently owned by Intuit. You can aggregate your financial transactions such as credit card purchases, payroll deposits, transfers, pretty much everything you can do with your bank or banks. This in turn can be classified into categories, and Mint does a pretty good job of that, but not perfect, and I'll cover later what I've done to address that. I'm going to show some obfuscated screenshots here of Mint since I don't need to show off all my personal data, good, bad, or otherwise. But you can see that we have a transaction list that's got a lot of data collected, years of my data in fact. And it's quite nice that an option exists to export this transaction list to a comma-separated data file. And it includes the classifications that have been applied by Mint. And doing the download is as simple as my clicking here. And you can see the CSV file appears as a download. So as for why we might want to do this in the first place, why not just stick with what Mint provides for reporting? And my feeling is that the reporting isn't everything that it could be. Even if Mint developers ultimately add more reports that do more, my preference is to build reports with modern BI tools such as Power BI to tell stories that are of direct use to answer specific questions I might have. And we can do a lot with this very simple data set, as I'm going to show. And just as one example, Mint added a chart on their overview page like shown here that shows your current month spending versus the prior month over each day of the month. And that's nice. It offers an important insight on how effective you're being in the current month. But maybe last month had some outliers, and wouldn't it be nicer to compare the current month against, say, an average of the last 6 months? That's something that Mint may never do, but we can do it quite easily with Power BI. Now, admittedly, not everyone can just up and start building DAX expressions and create fancy reports. So this video is partly about education for those who might be trying to learn Power BI or related technologies such as analysis services. But for those who just want to do what I'm doing here with their own data, I'll be making my PBIX file available on my website, and you can simply swap in your Mint comma-separated data file to have everything I'm showing here work for you exactly as is. And I'll be providing links and such at the end of the video. But let's start by building a new PBIX file from scratch. So here I'm in the Power BI desktop tool, freshly opened. So now I'm going to grab my data from the CSV file I previously downloaded. And is this my personal data? No. I've actually taken it and obfuscated the amounts on transactions using the Xscrape for Excel tool, available also on xscrape.com. But as part of this, I did want to preserve some of the categories and keep some general patterning to make the demo look what could be more realistic for an average Joe. So the amounts are all incorrect, but the Mint determined categories are really the star of the show here. So you can see that Power BI has imported my CSV file into one table that's available in the field list. And I'm going to rename it. I'll also go in and set the formatting for my amount to be currency and no decimal places. And let's also add a date dimension table. And this becomes useful since we can do interesting things with dates more easily, since we can join our Mint transaction dates with this date dimension. So here I'm going to copy and paste a DAX expression that I'm going to input after I've clicked on New Table. And in this case, the DAX expression I'm using uses the calendar function along with add columns. And I'm basically generating a table with every date between January the 1st, 2000 and December the 31st, 2025. And I'm going to make this DAX available in an upcoming article that I'll be publishing at www.xscrape.com/articles. And you can see now that we have two tables in our field list. And I'm going to relate these tables to each other, switching to the relationships and drawing the relationship using the date field. So what questions would I like to try and answer? Well, first I'd like to look at the last 3 years by month. I'd like to see how my spending has changed year over year, and doing it by month might tease out some outliers that show up at common times of the year, such as say biannual car insurance or other things like that. And another thing I'd like to do is forecast. For example, it's only September 2018 right now. So if I'm comparing year over year, it's not very fair to compare 2018 to 2017 because spending in 2018 is naturally going to be lower since 2018 is still in progress. So I'd like to come up with a projection for the remainder of 2018 where I can leverage what was done in 2017 for the portion of 2018 that's incomplete. For example, October 2018 can be made to look like October 2017 for the purposes of projection, which might not be a perfect comparison if I spend more or less in October this year, but at least gives a fair year-on-year comparison when looking at the entire year. So how do we solve these problems? But one thing I'm going to do is create a grouping of our categories that are supplied by Mint. I'll call it category exclude as a way to create major buckets of things that we might want to exclude from reporting. For example, transfers are like noise to us. We're only moving money around, it's not really income or expense. I may even want to exclude income from some types of analysis. So I'll just create a couple of groups here. And jumping ahead to show the final product, groups for this report page will focus on real expenses, which is everything that I left ungrouped in this case. And basically Mint has done a fairly good job identifying categories, but for reporting purposes the categories are a bit too granular, and my report grouping here is going to help. And next we need to establish what's the last day of data we have available in our Mint CSV file. And we can do that with a new measure, which I'm going to call last available data date. And I'm going to copy and paste in the DAX for it, and it's linked to the Mint transactions table. Another measure that I'll add is our prior year amount. And this uses more sophisticated DAX that I'll explain. So we're doing a calculate over a sum of our Mint transactions, which we've applied a date filter using the previous year's date. And this previous year date shows up on our date table. And let me just bring in a basic grid that shows our raw date table with these two dates showing as columns. Notice how we have date in the first column and the previous year date in the second column. And the measure maps at a day-by-day level, but it also works nicely when our report is grouping by month or year or whatever type of grouping we've applied. The DAX supports a sum that always operates at the correct level of grouping, pulling the prior year's amount for given a single date or a date range. Another measure we can use is a full year forecast amount. With this DAX, you can see that it again is a sum of amounts, but if the date is greater than the last day of the data we have in our Mint file, we're using the prior year amount, which we just previously added as a measure. And this is a good example of how we can chain measures, building more complex measures from simpler ones. And SumX in this case isn't something that I'm going to get into a lot of detail about here. It's effectively doing a row-by-row evaluation over our transaction set. But the important thing is we're getting amounts for every day of 2018, even ones in the future. The next measure I'm going to add is a forecast year-over-year amount. This one's pretty simple, just the full year forecast amount less the prior year amount. And next I'm going to add a measure for forecast year-over-year percentage. And this is our forecast year-over-year amount divided by the prior year amount. So if it's 0%, we have no change from the prior year. And then finally I'm going to add a forecast year-over-year percentage for the current year. The main difference here is we get the forecast year-over-year percentage just for this year, so 2018 versus 2017. Now I'm going to put together a simple matrix that shows months as rows and the last 3 years as columns. And instead of hard coding in the years as a filter, I'm going to use a feature of our date table that's called is last 3 years inclusive, and bring that in as a page filter and pick the true value as what we're going for here. And so now we don't have to update this report as time rolls on. It's going to always include 3 years of data. And another page filter that I'll add is our category group for exclusions, and I'll select specifically real expenses for this particular page. As for values I'm going to show in this matrix, let's include the total amount and the forecast year-over-year percentage. So this starts to get interesting. We can see that in August 2018, which was our last full month of data, we spent considerably less than in August 2017, which is nice. June was also a good month, but April was not. The year-over-year is pretty high there. So let's add one more visual to this page. Let's do a line and clustered column chart. For this one, let's use year as our column series, and the full year forecast amount as the column values, and the forecast year-over-year percentage for the current year as the line value. And I'll make a couple of visual tweaks here. But keep in mind, I'm not shooting for beauty as a main goal here, since I could spend a lot of time on that. And today I'd prefer just to kind of show off functionality. And this is interesting too. It's very similar to the data in the matrix. And notice how they're interrelated. I can click on values in either visual, and the default behavior causes filtering in the other visual. And with the bars, we get a nice quick idea of how last year, in 2017, October had a lot of spending, and the full year forecast for this year would match it. But perhaps it was an outlier, or there's a reason for October to now punish our pocketbooks more. So this could be a hint to prepare. And the line could tell us quickly how we're doing against last year, with below 0% being good, and for half of September and onward relying on last year's numbers. So 0% makes sense for those months. And at this point I could spend the rest of the video building more and more pages, but instead I'm going to cheat a bit and jump ahead by opening an existing file where I've added 5 more pages, and I'll just discuss each in their final form. So here's page 1, which we've already looked at, so I'm going to skip on. For page 2, I've called it discretionary, and here we'll focus on expenses that we have control over, such as food and entertainment, and excluding other things like rent and daycare, which is something I've got less control over. I might be able to get a cheaper mortgage or childcare, but let's assume this page is looking for easier opportunities. And one way to see what fields this page uses is to put focus on a visual such as this table on the left. And you can see what fields are used on the right as checked items. And this table is showing another group I've created over the Mint categories, where I've tried to bring together some Mint categories like, say, gas and tolls, and I've brought those into car and transit related. And I could do some of that in Mint and spend a lot of time cleaning that up, but with thousands of transactions over there, it's just easier to do it over here. I've also added another category grouping called Category Included that further groups things into discretionary and, for the lack of a better term, non-discretionary. Those items that I don't want to look at here. So I added a slicer at the bottom, which is going to filter them out for the entire page. Although technically I can bring in everything by changing the slicer selection, so it's kind of a nice way to gain some interactivity within the report itself. And then I added 2 tree maps on the right, effectively showing similar data to the table, but in a form that's quickly relatable. And the filters interact, as you can see here. The top one is year-to-date spending, and the bottom is full year forecast value, I previously mentioned. So if all other things are equal in the remainder of 2018 compared to 2017, the bottom one offers a projection. And you can see this in the tooltips too. Food is showing at about 11,000 spent so far, and a full year estimate of about 15.6 thousand. This is interesting here, where it's telling us, for example, that we're spending quite a bit more on the kids category compared to last year, both on the current year-on-year and the full year forecast, which is a hefty 88%. But on the flip side, entertainment spending is down based on the current spend, and the full year forecast still shows a 12% reduction. So we can certainly think about the whys here and focus on areas we think we can influence. For example, the kids spending could have been because of a new after-school program and we're consciously cutting back on entertainment, or maybe the kids are kept busy in after school, so less entertainment is needed. That's one of the beauties of data analysis. You can unmask truths that you might otherwise have missed. The next page is called Day of Month, and this one is a table with quite a bit of detail. The rows represent the days of the month, with the intention being of seeing a few things. We can see how much we tend to spend at different times of the month, how much is likely to be spent in the current month, and are we over or under spending compared to a typical month, which we're determining here by looking at the prior 6 months and averaging them. And you might instinctively know how your month generally flows, but this offers some tangible support. And the magic behind this one is focused around a calculated table created using DAX. And you can find the definition for it by clicking on the table in the field list. And notice I'm using summarize and grouping by the day of the month. So we end up with rows numbered from 1 through 31. Then I'm adding columns that include the things like the average amount per day, both including and excluding income. When I use the values without income, we're focusing on expenses only, and when it's included, we're really looking at the overall net by day. And I've included additional measures on top of this calculated table to do cumulative summing, so we have a running total by day. And how did I do the cumulative measures? And I can click on one like this one and see the DAX behind it. And for this one, I'm summing over all days of the month less than or equal to the day of the month of each row of our calculated table, which is by definition giving a cumulative sum specific to our day of the month table. So let's take a look at the columns I've made available here. The first one is the day of the month in ascending order. The next is your average expense size for that day of the month. So this could be interesting to see if some days have some especially large transactions, something you can plan for. The next column is your average expenses spent on each day, and this is based on an average over the prior 6 months. In my example here, you can tell that a large payment, probably our rent or mortgage, is coming out early in the month. And your total at the bottom is your overall monthly expense figure. The next column is similar to the prior one, but it's zeroed out days that have already passed. So the total here represents what you can expect to be spending over the remainder of the month. Next, we've got a per day view of both expenses and income. And the fact that our total line shows a positive value is good. Yay! We should in theory end the month with positive cash flow compared to the start of the month, assuming everything holds with the projections, which is what's effectively being shown. The next column is similar, but it's starting from today's date, trying to identify what the remainder of the month might look like if we started with 0 today. The column current month expense is showing what's gone on to date, and our total line is what we've effectively spent so far in the current month. For comparison, the next column is the prior month's expenses to compare side by side. And this can be interesting to again gain visibility to upcoming large in or outflows. And the final column offers a percentage comparison of the current month versus the averaged trailing 6 months. And this ratio is done on the cumulative values to reflect more about where we are currently versus our average months. A value of 100% means we're tracking exactly to the average as of a given day of the month. Above 100% means we're overspending, under 100% means we're underspending. And this concept flows into the next page titled Month Progress. And so on this page, we get a chart that looks a lot like the Mint.com chart showing progress through the current month. The main difference is the comparison is with the average of the last 6 months, not only the last month. The hope is in having an average over multiple months, you can smooth out things and capture some less frequent expenses or income. And we can see in this chart that we've been tracking somewhat closely to the average, with some days over and some days under. The last available day is somewhat over, so it might be a cue to tighten up a bit if things slide further above the average line. The next page is titled Net for Current Year, and this is a line chart that shows cumulative change from January 1st to today, considering both expenses and income. And this might offer confirmation about the cyclical pattern of your income and spending. And one of the things I'm trying to do here is create metrics that can point at either health or a lack of financial health overall. So for example, this trend line is pointing downward, which should perhaps worry me if this were my real finances. And this downtrend implies lower highs and lower lows, which could be a concern since it's persisting over the entire year, even though we're still staying in touch with net even for the year, which is the $0 line. So this visualization shows what's likely unsustainable spending, and some serious course correction is probably needed. And this might encourage us to go back and look for opportunities again based on categories. And one of the larger categories we had was for food. And that's the inspiration for the next page titled Food. And so from the discretionary page, we know that food is one of the larger outlays, and because it's technically discretionary, we can control our behavior about the kinds of food we buy, for example. There could be some value in understanding it more. So here I'm showing a simple card value that says during the last 6 months, average spending per day on food has been $41. And that sounds like a lot, and it might be a value I try to address. So how did I determine $41? If I click on the visual, we can see in the visual level filters that I've added category expenses, filtered specifically to food. And recall that's my own mapping, which takes a lot of smaller categories in Mint and calls them all food. And the amount field is the average amount per day, which is a measure we can see highlighted in the field list. So let's click on it to see the DAX behind it. And in this case, it's a simple sum over transaction amounts, but we then divide by days between. And that's a different measure on the date dimension. So let's check that out too. And we can see here that we're using the date diff function, finding the minimum and maximum date in our current filtered range and getting the number of calendar days between those two dates. And if we decided to increase this from being the last 6 months to the last 12 months, the formula doesn't need to change, it'll automatically adjust. And the clustered column line chart at the bottom is showing restaurant spending as a ratio of total food spending for the bars. And the line represents the forecast amount, in this case by month. And interestingly, it does seem to confirm quantitatively that we all probably suspect intuitively where spending a higher percentage on restaurants tends to lead to a higher overall food spend in any given month. Although that's not universally true, as August seems to show an exception there. We can also click on months here and see how the filter applies through to other visuals on the page, something that we can enable or disable as needed. I previously mentioned that we can easily change the source data behind this report. That's something you might want to do if you grab the full PBIX file. And I can do it here by changing the data source and picking a different CSV file sourced from Mint. And the key is that the format remains consistent, and then everything should work without needing to adjust the source beyond reselecting it. Okay, so that wraps up this demo over Mint data, and now here's a list of useful links that relate to what I have covered. And obviously this reporting is only as good as the source data you're using, so my advice would be to continually manage the classifications that Mint is applying. It's usually reasonably smart about auto-classifying, but sometimes it's just plain wrong. But you can manually correct on a transaction level, and even tell Mint to always classify certain things the same way, which works well most of the time. And I'm not going to claim that Mint is perfect for what I'm doing here, but it's pretty good and probably not worth building a completely new platform, especially since it's all free. Yes, free. Both Mint and Power BI Designer, which it's true, I've shown you looking at your data in a report designer as opposed to a deployed format, such as on powerbi.com. But then again, if it's your personal finance data, you might be just as happy to play with it locally like I've been showing here. And as I hope I've shown with Power BI reporting, you can answer nearly any question you can imagine about the data available from Mint too. And getting the data wasn't that hard at all. And hopefully this has given you some inspiration either from a development perspective or a financial perspective or both. And I encourage you to come visit my blog page where I do focus more on the development side, but I welcome feedback on what topics you'd like to see me covering in the future. And it's always nice to see a demo that you can relate to, so hopefully personal finance has given that. But although this might have seemed comprehensive, the reality is I've just scratched the surface of what you can do with Power BI and data analytics in general. If you really like the personal finance angle here, I'm okay with diving in deeper too, but I need to hear from you, so sign up at xrape.com and help me help you. Cheers everyone.